So what's going on here in front of me? You see here a Hasselblad box, but on top of that box you see a Fuji GFX camera. And the background is easily explained. A couple of weeks ago I posted my first impressions on the Fuji GFX 100S together with the GF 80mm f1.7 widest open aperture, and I think the footage coming out of this camera lens combo is basically not from this world. It's fantastic how it performs on portraits, but also on landscape and street. It's a fantastic lens on a fantastic camera body, and people ask me later on, can you not also look into the comparable setup in the Hasselblad lineup? And here in front of me is a very special lens, which is kind of the sibling of the GF 80mm f1.7. I will go into details in a moment. We'll mount this lens later on the Hasselblad X1D II. We'll go out and shoot. And then of course, when I collected my first impressions on this new lens here, I will also do a comparison in the next couple of weeks of the Fuji GFX 100S with the GF 80mm f1.7 and this lens here on the Hasselblad X1D II. And now let's kick off the video. Let's now get the Fuji GFX 100S aside and let's have a look on this new Hasselblad lens here. And first of all, it's still fully sealed here. So I got this brand new from one of my retailers. And if we look into the sticker here, we find that this is the XCD f1.9. So f1.9 compared to f1.7 on the Fuji 80mm. So we have the same focal length on the same sensor size, but we have a slightly more closed widest open aperture of f1.9 compared to f1.7 on the Fuji GF 80mm. Let's now do a quick unboxing, and I do this in a little time lapse because I don't think people want to see the unboxing in detail here. It's just a Hasselblad box with a Hasselblad lens. Having said that, it's a very special lens. And then let's have a first look at the lens when it's out of the box. Let's start with a first look on the lens, and let's start with the lens hood of the lens. So this is the usual full metal construction and it's very minimalistic. It says Hasselblad here. We have two markers here for orientation on how to screw this onto the lens. And here we basically get only the lens system XCD and the focal length 80mm. So quite nice. I should actually say that the minimalistic design on Hasselblad lenses sometimes really reminds me in Leica, because Leica is minimalistic in their design in exactly the same way. Let's turn our attention now to the lens itself, and lifting the lens up, what immediately catches attention is its weight. Oh boy, this is a very heavy lens, and on the flip side of the coin, it is smaller and more compact than its Fuji sibling GF 80mm f1.7. We'll clearly see this in the next video when I'm going to shoot these lenses side by side on its respective camera bodies and do a deep dive on the similarities and the differences. So smaller in size, but very, very heavy. And on the construction side, it's a full metal construction like what we are used to in the Hasselblad XCD lens lineup. It's minimalistic as its lens hood. You have an XCD 80mm and Hasselblad engraving here. That's basically all. And looking inside, you already get a glimpse that there is a lot of glass moved forth and back by the autofocus. And that is part of my test when I shoot these two cameras and two lenses side by side in the next video to see which one has the quicker and more spot on autofocus. So a very nice lens. I think I like a lot what I see here, and I also like that significant weight. I do not mind to have heavy lenses, and I think it will still fit very well the X1D II body and will be very good in hand, I guess. What's also eye-catching is the very large focus ring here with that rubber finish. And it's buttery smooth, it's super silent, so there's no scratching going on here or anything. And I think the build quality of this lens is beyond any doubt, but nothing less we expect, of course, from a Hasselblad XCD lens. From a pricing perspective, it's a very expensive lens. So it lines up nicely with typical Leica M lenses or Leica SL lenses. So its price tag, give or take, depending on where you purchase the lens, in which country and jurisdiction, is about $5,000. Which is significantly more expensive than the Fuji GF 80mm f1.7, which you can get for less than half of the price, brand new out of a retail store. So I think here in terms of pricing, Hasselblad always is at the upper side of the spectrum in the same way as we know it from Leica. I think it's time now to have a look into the spec sheet, collect a few data points. Then I'm going to mount this lens on the Hasselblad X1D Mark II. Then I'm going outside, we'll do test images, we'll play with the lens, get familiar with it and see how much I like it. We'll share my footage and images here in this video, and then in a couple of weeks there will be a comprehensive review of this lens compared to the GF 80mm f1.7 from Fuji, shot on the GF X100S, and this one of course on my Hasselblad X1D Mark II. Let's now have a look what Hasselblad themselves are telling us about their XCD 80mm lens. And here's the Hasselblad website, and if we look into the specs they give us here, let's zoom this in a little bit, you see that the aperture of f1.9 boils actually down to a wider open f1.5 if you look at it from a full frame equivalent perspective. And how can they know that? Because the crop factor, if you migrate from a Hasselblad sensor to a full frame sensor, is 0.79, and 0.79 times 1.9 yields 1.5. So on the aperture side, that's what you need to be applied in terms of a crop factor. In terms of focal length, the 80mm multiplied by 0.79 yield a 63mm equivalent focal length on a full frame setup. And that's what people typically should bear in mind if you have actually an aperture which doesn't sound super wide. On a medium format camera sensor, it typically is wider than you think because you have a crop factor smaller than 1 and you need to apply it to the aperture to actually end up in the full frame equivalent, which here is f1.5. What this little summary also provides to us is a minimum focusing distance of 70 centimeters or 28 inch. And that's as close as you get to your subject, and you also get the reproduction ratio in its maximum here at 1 divided by 6.4. And that means you can use this lens to some extent also for close-ups, in particular since on the 50 megapixel Hasselblad sensor you can nicely crop in and then generate macro type appearances in your images. You have an aperture range from widest open f1.9 to f32. And all in, I think you get a lot of interesting features here already in this little summary. You have a leaf shutter in the lens and you have exposure times like with all other XCD lenses from 60 minutes at maximum length to 1/2000 seconds with full flash synchronization, which is special and is of course coming from that mechanism which people call a leaf shutter, where the shutter is actually sitting in the lens. If you hear the word leaf shutter for the very first time, no worries, here is a little explanation again by Hasselblad what that is all about. It's also called a central type shutter, and it basically means instead of in most camera systems where the shutter is sitting in the camera body, it's actually sitting in the lens, and that minimizes vibration. It's also good from a durability perspective, and in particular, and that's very valuable in particular for studio photography, you can actually synchronize with a flash up to 1/2000 of a second without any special arrangements on your gear. A little further down on that website you find the data sheet, which is what I want to open now. And then we find even more specifics of the lens, and we also find them nicely ordered here in form of a table. And what you see here, the weight is 1044 gram. And you have a filter diameter of 77 millimeters. We come to that in a moment again. And again, you get the full frame equivalent focal length of 63 millimeters, and you also find the angle of use here in the 3 different dimensions, all quite nice. And in general, I think if we look in this data sheet, it's a quite complex lens here. We have 14 elements in 9 groups. And clearly, as I said at the beginning of the video when I unboxed the lens, it's a very heavy lens. There's a lot of glass in it, and this creates disadvantages when it comes to autofocus, which I'm also going to cover quickly at the second half of the video. Since we are now familiar with the most important data points of that brand new lens here, let's mount it on the Hasselblad X1D Mark II. And currently on my X1D Mark II, I have the XCD 45, not the 45p, which is a much smaller lens, but the 45 with widest open aperture of f3.5. So let's get this mounted here. And let's get the new 80mm lens mounted. Hasselblad, very convenient, red dot at 12 o'clock. It will always fit. You don't have to look into the mount of the camera. And looking at that lens camera combo, looks quite nice. Actually, I cannot resist. I have to quickly show the X1D Mark II with the XCD 80mm side by side with the Fuji GF X100S and the GF 80mm f1.7. Just because I'm curious how to see them side by side. Here are the two cameras which I'm going to compare in the next video in a couple of weeks. On the right hand side we have the GF X100S from Fuji, on the left hand side we have the Hasselblad camera, and the difference in size is not that big. The Fuji clearly is a little bit wider in the camera body, and it also looks like it is a little bit taller. In particular, the electronic viewfinder here is contributing to that difference in size, but in general they are still quite comparable. Looking at the lens hood here, we also see that the Fuji lens hood is a little bit bigger, and I also think that the Hasselblad lens hood fits inside the Fuji lens hood, confirming that the Fuji lens here is a little bit more voluminous, which is quite interesting. Looking at the lenses side by side, you see here that the Fuji lens is a little bit larger in the diameter of the lens tube, but still comparable to the Hasselblad. I think my statement at the beginning of the video is true. The Hasselblad lens is a bit more compact than the Fuji lens, but the difference in size is not that big, and I don't think that should be a criteria for anyone to argue that one or the other lens is more handleable. From a weight perspective, the Hasselblad lens is the heavier lens. We have 1044 gram here, so more than 1 kilogram, and we have 795 gram on the GF 80mm. So in terms of size, the Hasselblad is a bit smaller, a bit more compact. On the weight side, the Hasselblad is more heavy. As said, I will be much more comprehensive in the comparison of these two top camera lens combos in the next video, but there is one more remark I want to make. Clearly, the diameter of the lens tube based on this massive focus ring here on the Fuji GF X100S and the GF 80mm, which makes the lens appearing a bit bigger, the filter size is nevertheless the same. So if we look into the Hasselblad lens, we find here the 77mm filter size, and if we look at the lens here, we find here 77mm filter size. So it's just the design of the lens which actually makes the GF 80mm bigger and looking more voluminous than what you have on the Hasselblad. On the weight side, as I said, this one is heavier by about 240 grams. I will now take this lens camera combo outside and test the image quality we get, and also the autofocus and all the things I'm interested in when trying out a new lens. But before I do so, I want to quickly add one more remark, and for this let's dismount the lens very quickly. And if you look here at the bottom of the lens, you find a very robust weather sealing, which is a rubber sealing and is kind of the same as what you find on the Fuji GF lenses. So in both camera systems you get fully weather sealed lenses, and I think that's important because you never know what happens out there in the field. I appreciate that feature, and typically I always try for lenses to get only lenses which are weather sealed. I think the big exception are Leica M lenses. They are not officially weather sealed, but they are nevertheless known for being very robust under all kinds of weather conditions. Now let's mount the lens back. Let's go outside, and then I'm going to share my sample images and my experiences from the shootings. And then in the next video, we'll compare this camera lens combo with the Fuji lens combo in the equivalent setup. I hope the last couple of minutes have been convincing to you that this is an absolutely fantastic lens. I can already say right now, this is one of the best lenses I've ever owned. And the level of detail you get, the level of clarity, every image appears in a way as if you would stand real life in front of the scene and would see everything with your naked eyes. It's just absolutely fantastic and perfect. The dreaminess of the bokeh and the background blurriness is also fantastic. The way background lights get blurred out and get these circle disc images also is perfect. Here is actually one of the spots where I'm typically taking photos of the churches in Zurich, and you see people here sitting on that wall, and you get so much detail and so much clarity in these images. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. If you print these images in large dimensions and place them on the wall, it's almost like one of these hidden objects images where you can stand in front of it and then find more details, more information about what's going on in the front of you, the longer you stand there and try to observe and spot tiny little details hidden in the image. Before I come to observations on autofocus, let's have a look into this image here. And this was exposed with a comparably fast shutter speed, and in this way is sharp and crisp. But the X1D Mark II and the X1D do not have in-body image stabilization, and if in the next image I violate the shutter speed rule 1 divided by focal length or 1 divided by 1.5 times focal length, the image is no longer sharp and suffers from motion and therefore gets a little bit blurry. And here clearly the Fuji GF X100S has some advantage based on in-body image stabilization. I stop my presentation of sample images in a moment, just a few more images to again illustrate the incredible sharpness of this 80mm lens. Here you see another image where you see so many details on that fern here. It's just amazing. You know, I also looked into portraits. Here, for instance, the focus was sitting on the left-hand eye, pinpoint sharp, and you also saw the portrait from the skater before in Zurich. And here I switched focus to the right hand eye, and again is super sharp, but the left hand eye is then a bit fuzzy and not as sharp as the one where the focus is sitting. So quite nice, I think. In general, a great lens also for portraits, of course, but for any kinds of applications you might have in mind. The last topic I want to quickly cover is autofocus. And the X1D and the X1D Mark II are both not known for a very fast autofocus. It's a very reliable autofocus, so it typically sits where you want it to sit, but it's not really fast. And this gets even worse with that heavy lens here and the massive glass inside, which needs to be moved forth and back by the focus mechanism. So let's do a little autofocus demo here, and maybe in order to make this a bit more tangible, let's go here into the settings and let's go into sound. And in sound, if I'm not mistaken, yes, you can actually checkbox this one here, and then autofocus, if it is sitting, is confirmed by a beep. And let's make this beep very loud so we can all hear it loud and clearly. All right, let's go for a little test here on different subjects. Let's start to focus, half pressing shutter button. So you see that autofocus is not super quick. And I should say for me that's not a problem, because I think the quality of images you get out of this lens pays you back 1,000 times for the lack of a fast autofocus. But for some people it might be a problem if you're investing in one camera system only and you think this is the one to go for, which I can always recommend because it's one of the best cameras currently available in the market. But then you should be aware for sports and action, this is maybe not the best choice. And there is one feature on the lens which I want to quickly mention, and that's that with the focus ring you can override the autofocus. And that is really convenient because normally you switch here at the top button between autofocus and manual focus. So if I switch that button here, if you look here, so now this is in manual focus, you see here appearing MF, and now this is back into autofocus. But even in autofocus, you can override your focus by turning the focus ring here. And let's try to do this. But I can also immediately manually override it. So here, for instance, you see this, I find immediately focus, and I can basically combine the autofocus and manually fine adjustments on the focus ring to get the focus improved if required. I should say in all situations I had, autofocus typically is reliable. It sits where you want it to sit, but it is super, super slow. And I think that's something people should be aware of. Now, in general, for me, not a problem, because as a Leica M shooter, I'm used to manually finding focus anyway. And as I said, the quality of images produced by that lens, they pay you back 1,000 times. So no problem for me, but something worthwhile to mention. I will conclude my review here and hope you liked what I presented and the way I tried to provide a fair representation of that lens. Image quality, that lens is absolutely fantastic. There is hardly any lens which can beat it. It's playing at the top of Leica lenses, Canon lenses, Nikon lenses, you know, Sony lenses, whatever you have. It's the top-notch ranking lens in the Hasselblad XCD lineup, and I don't think that people make a mistake investing in that lens, because it will pay you back 1,000,000 times when it comes to portraits, but also to landscapes, cities, close-ups, whatever you have. It's a perfect, absolutely fantastic lens. Having said that, for sports and action, not a recommendation. Autofocus is just too slow based on contrast detection and no included face detection. And on that heavy construction of the lens, of course, maybe Hasselblad will improve it over time with a firmware update, or maybe bringing new cameras with improved autofocus and with better suitability for sports and action, and then having invested in that lens will clearly pay back, because it will fit the Hasselblad system no matter what camera body you use. Currently you have at least 3 bodies you can use: the X1D, the X1D Mark II and the 907X, and on all these cameras the lens will do a great job. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there's always more to come. In particular, in the next couple of weeks, that comparison between Hasselblad and Fuji systems in the equivalent setup with their 80mm lenses. Stay safe and healthy, and peace out.